Remember this slide? There I mentioned this predictable state management, this predictable flow, the clearly defined data flow, which makes sure that we have to use a certain approach of updating our data and of getting our data, and this would be less error prone. Well, actually, the way we're using Vuex at the moment works, but it's not fully following the Vuex philosophy. We're directly tapping into our store state to change something from inside a component. And whilst this works technically here, this is not ideal. We can change the state from anywhere in the application, and it's up to us if we add 1 or if we set it equal to state counter plus 10, or we have a typo and accidentally type 1 twice and hence add 11 every time we increment this. So what I want to say is that here we still can introduce errors because we're not having a clearly defined state changing mechanism. We can change the state from anywhere. That is why we should use Vuex a bit differently. We have this app-wide central data store, this state store, and we communicate with it from inside our components. Now I have a dashed arrow here because yes, we want to communicate, but not directly. What we're doing at the moment is not ideal. Instead, Vuex has a built-in concept called mutations. Mutations are clearly defined methods which have the logic to update the state. And from inside our components, we should in the end just trigger those mutations instead of directly manipulating the state. By triggering mutations, all components that want to edit a state do it in the same way, and it's guaranteed that they do it in the same way. And to give you an example, I will actually add another component here, change counter.view, and this will be a very simple component which also just has a button where I also say add 1, and where upon a click I want to trigger add 1. And then I have my script in here, and in there my methods, where I have the add 1 method, and every component is able to use Vuex as you learned it. So here I can access store state counter and increment this by 1. Now in app view we can import change counter and register it as a component and use it in addition to the button which we already have here. So I got 2 buttons now, one here in the app component and one in change counter. Both should add 1, but here I'm adding 11 because I mistyped or I changed my logic and forgot to rename the method and the text on the button, whatever. But now we have 2 buttons, one button adds 11 and one really adds 1. Now why am I doing this? I want to show you that now we have different places in the app where we update our state. And even if we wouldn't have that stupid mistake of having 11 here, even if we would have 1, if we ever decide that we want to add 2, we have to change that in 2 components. We have to go to 2 components and change our logic in 2 places. And in bigger applications, we might have even more places where we need to change the logic. Now that's a lot of code duplication, and that's exactly why we have this mutations concept. Back in main.js, where we create our store, we don't just have the state here, we also have mutations. Mutations takes an object, and in this object you can define methods. For example, a add 1 method, or increment, whatever you want to call it. And this method should contain the logic to change this state. Now this method will automatically get the current state as an argument. This is guaranteed by Vuex. Vuex will give us the current state whenever this method is triggered, and I will show you how to trigger such a method in a second. And since we get the current state here, the guaranteed latest state, we can access state counter in here and increment this by 1. Also, of course, with this code. Or if we ever change our logic, we simply change it here. And now we want to trigger this mutation from all the places that should change our state. And of course, it should be needless to say that you can have multiple mutations. You can have as many as you need for your application. So here I got one, and I want to trigger it for the button in app view and for the button in change counter. Now let's start with the button in change counter. Here, to trigger a mutation, we access this $store, but now there we got a commit method. It's a built-in method which Vuex gives you on its store. And commit takes the name of the mutation you want to perform. In this case, that's increment, and the name should be provided as a string. It's increment because I named my mutation increment. If you used a different name here, you also need to commit a different name. But now we can commit this here in change counter and also in app view. And now we moved the logic, the concrete logic on how the state is updated out of the components into our store, into this mutation. And we just commit this mutation from inside our components. So now if we save that, this still works, but now with help of mutations, which is the more elegant and more predictable way of updating our state.